What is firmware, system, and vendor? That is the topic of discussion for today's Android custom ROM basics. Now, these are three words which you hear a lot when you flash custom ROMs: firmware, vendor, system. What are these? Let us start with firmware. So, firmware is the lowest level of software which has direct contact or direct interaction with the hardware, and you as a user generally do not directly interact with the firmware. So, your baseband, modem, the Wi-Fi, those might be part of your firmware, and it is very hardware specific. The best example could be your BIOS on a computer, or let us say Samsung makes a display, right? So the display, to control it, they might have another small chip attached with the display which has the firmware for the specific display. Now it's not like every single display will have its own firmware, but say Samsung makes these E4 AMOLED panels which they market and sell to say Xiaomi. So that E4 AMOLED panel might have its own chip which has its own specific firmware. So that is what firmware is. Next up, we need to talk about system and vendor. But before that, and before I forget, firmware is something which custom ROMs generally do not tend to change or mess with, which is why they do want you to be on the latest firmware. Next up, system and vendor. But before we jump over to vendor, we need to first talk about system and how we came to system and vendor being separate. So prior to Android 8.0 Oreo, everything was one thing. So system and vendor were one thing. In fact, the concept of vendor did not exist. So what made Google to bring up the concept of vendor? Now the Android system as a whole has, different parts. You have Android itself, then you have some parts from say the chip manufacturer, which could be your Samsung or Qualcomm. Those parts are there in part of the Android system. This is, I'm talking prior to Android 8.0 Oreo. Then let us say you have a device with a in-display fingerprint scanner. So this right here, the Redmi K20 Pro which I'm using, has an in-display fingerprint scanner. So you have three different parts, right? You have Google's Android, then you have software part from say Qualcomm, and then you have this fingerprint on display implementation from say Xiaomi. If this device was released prior to Android 8.0 Oreo, all of those would be bundled inside the system. Now this was causing issues. This was causing delays in software updates. Why? Because once Google rolled out a new version of Android, they would send it over to say Xiaomi. Xiaomi would make the changes, and then Xiaomi would also have to wait for Qualcomm to make the appropriate changes, and then this whole life cycle was taking a lot of time, and Sony has explained this best. And of course, all relevant links are linked in the description of this video. So the whole cycle of an Android update was taking a long time. People started complaining about it. There was fragmentation, all those things. So Google came up with something called Project Treble. And that is where they said that we need to separate things. So Google said that Android framework, Android as a whole, without your proprietary parts, which includes, say, the stuff from Qualcomm, or say the fingerprint on display implementation from Xiaomi. Why I am picking the example of FOD is because Android or AOSP does not support fingerprint in display at the time of recording this video. Hopefully with Android 12 they are going to start supporting it, but right now they don't. So Qualcomm stuff and your fingerprint on display stuff from say Xiaomi, that is something which is not related to, or something which could be separated. So which is why the concept of vendor came in, because for Google, Xiaomi is a vendor, Qualcomm is a vendor, Samsung is a vendor. So they said that we are going to separate all of this. So what Google makes, Android, and then whatever device specific or hardware specific stuff is there, they said move it to another partition called vendor. How does this help? This helps because they also said go ahead and make it standardized so that you can use the same vendor implementation across multiple Android software updates or version updates, to be more specific. And with that, Google, the aim was that Android updates are faster, and of course, they have since become faster. But do note, a lot depends on the OEM as well. But the advantage that gave us custom ROM people, or to people who like to tinker with their devices, is the concept of generic system images or GSIs, because since the original vendor implementation is supposed, again, keyword is supposed, since the original vendor implementation is supposed to, support multiple Android updates, you now have GSIs of say Android 12 running on this Redmi K20 Pro, the Poco F1 without any issues, and of course we do have awesome great developers as well. And one last thing before I forget, if you say ever unzip a recovery image for any Xiaomi device, right, the old ones, not the new ones, but old ones, which is why you see something called a folder called firmware, then you have system, then you have vendor, and you also have boot. So boot is your, of course, the kernel image or the boot partition. System is system, vendor is vendor, and the firmware folder is firmware. Custom ROMs, as I mentioned earlier, generally do not mess with firmware. They leave that alone. They sometimes do change stuff in the vendor as well, which is why some custom ROMs might come with their own vendor and some might use the existing MIUI or OnePlus vendor as well. So I hope that cleared some doubts about what is firmware, system, and what is vendor. Of course, I think the next video I should make on is about OSS vendor versus stock vendor.